All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's on the Power Show. In this video, I want to talk about a bodybuilder by the name of Brian Buchanan. Now, there's so much talk today about guys with these big waists in bodybuilding. I don't think there's enough talk about guys that had the crazy small waists in bodybuilding. And in my opinion, Brian Buchanan had proportionally the smallest waist in bodybuilding. So I'm not talking about in terms of sheer measurement the smallest waist, even though he only had a 28-inch waist with an expanded chest of 57 inches, creating one of the greatest V-tapers ever. But proportionally, I don't think we've ever seen another bodybuilder that had a waist as small as he had with an upper body as big as he had, creating that waist to upper body ratio that was just absolutely out of this world. Now, if you want to talk about some of the greatest vacuum poses of all time, you've got to have Brian Buchanan in that conversation. Now, granted, Frank Zane had an amazing vacuum pose, but he didn't have nearly the upper body mass that Brian Buchanan had, because not only did Brian Buchanan have this tiny waist, he was able to pull off an incredible vacuum pose. He had actually really big arms, really big chest, and pretty good lats as well to accompany this small waist, creating possibly one of the greatest classic physiques that we had ever seen. Now, Brian Buchanan competed primarily in the 1980s. Specifically, he would hit his stride in the late 80s. Now, unfortunately, we would only get the opportunity to see Brian Buchanan compete at the Mr. Olympia competition on two occasions, in 1988 and 1989. So in 1988, he placed 7th at the Mr. Olympia, and in 1989, he placed 8th. But 1988, I would say, was his better of the two Olympia appearances, having what many would describe as the V-taper from hell. Probably the best V-taper on the Olympia stage, but really in terms of his overall impression on the Olympia, he never did better than 7th, so that's probably why a lot of you guys have not heard of him. And the reason why I think he didn't place very highly is because although he had this incredible upper body ratio, I don't think his legs were as good as the upper body. So I think his legs were certainly a lacking point just in terms of overall size. But had he had bigger legs and maybe a little bit more overall muscle mass, you could have seen Brian Buchanan win a Mr. Olympia. But keep in mind, during the time that he was competing at the Mr. Olympia in 88 and 89, these are both years that we would see Lee Haney win. And Lee Haney, in my opinion, was essentially just a bigger version of Brian Buchanan. I mean, if you compare both Lee Haney and Brian Buchanan's front double bicep with a vacuum pose, they look extremely similar, except for the fact that Lee Haney is just a little bit bigger than him. So when people say bodybuilding, it has a lot to do with illusion and creating this illusion of an X frame or a V taper. I think Brian Buchanan was simply just the master of that. He was the embodiment of that illusion. Having a waist as small as he did made his upper body look so much bigger, made his V-taper look that much crazier, and it even made his legs look bigger, despite the fact they were actually not that big. Having a waist that small going into the legs made the legs look that much bigger. So despite the fact that Brian Buchanan did not have that much success within the IFBB, he was very successful in the organization known as NABBA. And as many of you already know, NABBA was basically the premier title in bodybuilding prior to the Mr. Olympia. The NABBA Mr. Universe competition was the most sought-after title prior to 1965. And Brian Buchanan would win that NABBA Mr. Universe competition in 1984 prior to entering the IFBB. And then after leaving the IFBB, he would go back to NABBA in 1995 and win the NABBA Universe again. And then 3 years later, he would come back to the IFBB in 1998, placing 13th at the Night of Champions, then placing 9th at the Toronto Pro Invitational. So I just wanted to share that with you guys. I'm sure a lot of people are getting tired of people talking about the biggest guts in bodybuilding today, and rather it'd be interesting to focus on one of the smallest guts of all time, or one of the smallest waists. You can't even call it a gut. He didn't have any type of gut whatsoever. One of the smallest waists of all time. So let me know what you guys thought about the video in the comment section below. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.